The record does not open with an origin story. It opens with a movement. Authority is not imagined into being, nor argued for, nor justified by conquest. It is said to arrive. The phrasing is spare, almost clerical, as though the scribe were noting a transfer rather than commemorating an event. The line sits at the threshold of the archive. Neither explanation nor myth, simply a statement about placement. Something known as kingship was not present, and then it was. In the earliest surviving recension of the Sumerian king list, the sentence stands apart from what follows. Before any names appear, before reign lengths stretch into improbable spans, there is only that formula. Kingship descended from heaven. The verb choice is quiet. It does not announce creation. It does not indicate selection. It records arrival. For the scribe, this seems to have required no elaboration, as though the audience already understood what such descent meant in administrative terms. What follows confirms that expectation. Once kingship is said to have descended, it begins to relocate. The list does not linger on divine action. Instead, it traces custody. Kingship moves from city to city, each transfer recorded with the same neutral hand. Eridu, Batibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurup. The emphasis is not on the kings themselves, but on where kingship resides, as though authority were an object temporarily housed within urban institutions. Individuals come and go, but kingship remains intact, moving intact, surviving intact. The structure of the list reinforces this. It reads less like a genealogy and more like a ledger of stewardship. Names are paired with lengths of reign, but there is no narrative of achievement. No battles are described, no laws are proclaimed. The king is measured by duration, not by deed. This suggests that, for the compilers, kingship was not defined by action, but by continuity. The role mattered more than the person occupying it. Even the extraordinary reign lengths, often taken as exaggeration, behave like accounting entries rather than boasts. The numbers are precise, internally consistent, and aligned with sexagesimal conventions used elsewhere in administrative texts. They do not, very stylistically, they do not crescendo, they simply accumulate. This consistency implies that the list was not designed to persuade, but to preserve. It treats time as something kept, not dramatized. Significantly, the descent of kingship is not associated with a specific god. The Anunnaki are not named in this opening formula. Heaven functions as a jurisdiction rather than a character. In later hymns and literary compositions, divine assemblies speak and decide. But here, the archive remains impersonal. Authority arrives from above, but its source is left undefined, perhaps because naming it was unnecessary for the function of the document. The list's task was not theology, but order. Later copies of the list preserve this same opening without modification, even when political realities had changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Cities gained and lost prominence, yet scribes continued to reproduce the descent formula verbatim. This fidelity suggests institutional memory rather than creative retelling. The line was not updated to match ideology. It was conserved, as though altering it would disrupt the logic of succession that followed. When the text reaches the flood, the language does not change. There is no lamentation, no divine argument. The line is brief. The flood swept over the land. Kingship was taken to heaven. The same authority that descended is now withdrawn, not destroyed. After the flood, kingship descends again, and the list resumes. The continuity is striking. Authority survives catastrophe by relocation, not reinvention. This treatment frames kingship as something independent of human society, yet dependent on it for expression. It exists beyond cities but requires cities to function. From this perspective, the role of the Anunnaki, hinted at, but not detailed, appears less like that of creators and more like custodians. They do not establish kingship anew. They oversee its placement, ensuring its persistence through disruption. The scribes who copied these lists worked within temple and palace archives. They were trained to replicate, not interpret. Their task was to transmit sanctioned memory. That they preserved this formula without explanation suggests that its meaning was assumed, embedded within the culture of administration. Kingship descended because that was how authority entered the world, not through innovation but through assignment. This understanding reshapes how the earliest Sumerian rulers might have viewed themselves. A king was not an originator of order, but a recipient. His legitimacy rested not on personal power but on alignment with an already existing structure. Reign lengths mattered because they marked stability. The end of a reign signified transition, not collapse. Kingship continued, regardless of the individual. The list does not ask the reader to believe. It asks the reader to remember. Its authority lies in repetition, not persuasion. Each copy affirms that what mattered most was not how kingship began, but that it had always arrived from elsewhere, already formed, already valid. If kingship was understood as something transferred rather than invented, and if its descent was recorded without explanation because explanation was unnecessary, then what precisely were the Anunnaki administering when they allowed it to arrive? And what earlier order made such administration possible in the first place? The descent of kingship leaves behind a problem that the record does not rush to resolve. Authority arrives, but those associated with its administration are already present in the language. Their names appear without introduction, without genealogy, without narrative framing. They are written as if they were known in advance. The transition from authority to its overseers is seamless, almost reflexive, suggesting that the scribes did not experience these figures as newly defined beings, but as established categories within their working vocabulary. The term that modern readers render as Anunnaki enters the tablets in this way. It does not announce itself. It is not glossed. In the earliest administrative and lexical texts, the word sits, among other designations, scribal, divine, institutional, without explanation. This placement is telling. Sumerian scribes were meticulous when new terms were introduced. Foreign names were clarified. Obsolete signs were accompanied by lists. Technical language was stabilized through lexical series. Yet the Anunnaki require none of this. In lexical lists, such as those used for scribal training, the term appears in grouped contexts, aligned with other collective designations, rather than individual deities. It behaves linguistically like a classification. The structure of the word itself has invited much later speculation, but the tablets do not pause to analyze it. There is no etymological aside. No mythic backstory is attached to its first occurrences. The scribes write the name as they would write elders, judges, or overseers, implying function rather than character. This functional placement becomes clearer when the term is observed across genres. In hymns, the Anunnaki are present but rarely active. They do not speak often. They do not embark on journeys. They are invoked as a collective that confers legitimacy or witnesses decree. In administrative texts, their presence is even more restrained. They are referenced indirectly through institutions, festivals, or allocations that assume their authority without dramatizing it. Language here does not describe what they do, only what is done under their supervision. Notably absent are origin formulas. Individual gods often receive genealogies. They are called sons or daughters, born of named figures, rising within a cosmic family. The Anunnaki resist this treatment. They are rarely individualized and almost never historicized. The language does not situate them in time. There is no when they were born, no in the days before. Their existence is treated as static, outside the flow of events that governs kings and cities. This absence has consequences for how their role is understood. Without origins, the Anunnaki cannot be framed as innovators. Innovation requires a before and an after. The tablets offer neither. Instead, the Anunnaki appear as constants within a system of change, anchoring transitions rather than instigating them. Linguistically, they resemble categories of office more than personalities. Even when verbs are attached to them, those verbs are administrative in tone. They decree, they assign, they confirm. The actions attributed to them align closely with bureaucratic procedure. There is no language of invention, experimentation, or discovery. When destinies are said to be fixed, the phrasing mirrors that used in legal or contractual contexts. Destiny behaves like jurisdiction, not prophecy. The scribe's restraint extends to naming conventions. Individual Anunnaki names are rare and inconsistent. When they do appear, they often overlap with other divine figures, suggesting fluid boundaries rather than defined identities. This fluidity would be problematic in myth, but is tolerable in administration, where roles can be shared or transferred without confusion. The lack of precision does not weaken the term. It makes it adaptable. Later, literary compositions elaborate on the Anunnaki. But even there, the core linguistic behavior remains unchanged. They are invoked collectively, often in fixed phrases, as though the scribe were inserting a standard clause. This formulaic usage reinforces the sense that the term belonged to a stable register of meaning. It was not a story element to be developed, but a reference point to be acknowledged. What is most striking is what the language does not attempt. It does not persuade the reader of Anunnaki's reality. It does not define them against alternatives. It assumes consensus. This suggests that by the time these tablets were written, the term already belonged to an inherited framework of understanding. The scribes did not need to explain it because the explanation lay outside their task. They were preserving usage, not justifying belief. If the Anunnaki were understood primarily through function rather than narrative, their place within Sumerian thought may have been less about who they were and more about what they maintained. Language, in this case, becomes evidence of memory rather than imagination, revealing a system that valued continuity over origin. If the names themselves carry no stories of beginning, only indications of role, then does this silence reflect a forgotten narrative, or was the absence preserving not a tale, but an administrative structure inherited from a time the tablets themselves no longer attempt to remember? The names that resist explanation leave behind a quieter trace, one that does not rely on language alone. Before theology expands into architecture, before sanctuaries rise above the plain, Teddy's clay, small, unassuming tablets pressed with signs that do not praise, persuade, or commemorate. They count. De y ayokate. De y record. The archive, it seems, settles into place before the temple announces itself. The earliest tablets recovered from Uruk do not describe gods. They describe commodities, barley measured into standardized units, sheep listed by categories, laborers grouped by task. These tablets come from the late 4th millennium BCE, emerging from levels where monumental religious structures are still embryonic. The writing is utilitarian, repetitive, and remarkably confident, as though the system it serves is already mature. What is absent from these tablets is as significant as what they contain. There are no hymns, no cosmogonies, no myths of divine struggle or creation. Instead, signs repeat in stable patterns, indicating that writing itself was shaped to serve administration. The earliest script is not expressive. It is procedural. It exists to make memory durable, not meaning poetic. At Eridu, the pattern aligns. Excavation layers show long occupation and ritual continuity, yet the written material that survives is dominated by accounting. Even here, where later tradition situated the earliest temple of Enki, the textual evidence privileges management over myth. Offerings are not explained. They are logged. Deities are not introduced. They are assumed. Among these early records are ration lists that include allocations made to divine estates. Grain, beer, oil distributed not to gods directly, but to institutions associated with them. The language does not distinguish sharply between human and divine recipients. Both appear within the same accounting frameworks. The difference lies only in designation, not treatment. This suggests that divine presence was embedded within economic structures, rather than standing apart from them. The tablets themselves are modest in scale, often palm-sized, designed for handling rather than display. Their value lay in their accuracy, not their permanence. Many were likely discarded after use, recycled, or archived temporarily. Yet the system they reflect is anything but temporary. Standardized measures, repeated sign clusters, and consistent formatting imply a shared administrative culture across regions. This raises a question of sequence. If writing emerges first as a tool for administration, and if administration includes divine estates from its inception, then theology may have been articulated through practice before it was articulated through monument. The gods appear first as entries, not as statues. Their needs are calculated before they are glorified. Monumental temples, when they do appear, align closely with these administrative systems. Their layout accommodates storage, redistribution, and supervision. The architecture supports the archive. In Tissensei, the temple is not the origin of order, but its amplification. It gives physical form to relationships already stabilized on clay. The ration lists tied to divine estates are particularly revealing. They imply routine. Offerings are scheduled, quantified, and predictable. There is no sense of negotiation or improvisation. The gods, as represented here, do not demand. They receive. Their sustenance is part of a broader logistical flow that sustains the city as a whole. Such a system would not require constant theological explanation. It would require training. Scribes had to learn signs, measures, and procedures. The gods entered this training as fixed variables. Their presence did not disrupt the system. It confirmed it. This again suggests inheritance rather than invention. The scribal curriculum did not teach why divine estates existed, only how to account for them. The absence of narrative in these tablets is not a gap to be filled, but a signal. Writing was not born from storytelling needs, but from the pressure of coordination. Civilization, at least as preserved here, begins with the management of resources, not the articulation of belief. Divine authority is woven into this management so seamlessly that it requires no textual justification. If record-keeping precedes monumental theology, then belief may have been stabilized through repetition long before it was formalized in stone. The Anunnaki, present as overseers in later texts, may have functioned first as assumed authorities within these systems, their power expressed through distribution rather than decree. If the earliest written traces of Sumerian society show a world already organized, already allocating resources to divine institutions without explanation, then what unseen structure made such confidence possible before temples rose to declare it? The accounting continues, without adjustment. What enters the record next is not proclamation or praise, but receipt. Goods move inward, are measured, and are redistributed according to schedules that leave little room for spontaneity. In the temple archives, the gods appear not as distant authorities, but as recipients within an institutional flow, dependent on the same mechanisms that sustain the city. Offering lists from urban centers such as Lagash and its cultic district of Gusu preserve this pattern with remarkable clarity. The tablets list barley, dates, wool, beer, and oil, arranged in columns under headings that designate recipients. Human officials, work gangs, and divine estates occupy adjacent positions. The formatting does not shift when the line moves from temple staff to a god's household. Only the sign sequence changes, not the procedure. These lists are precise. Quantities are fixed. Delivery intervals are regular. In some cases, short notations indicate shortages or substitutions, suggesting that divine allotments were subject to the same logistical constraints as all others. There is no language of appeasement or emergency. If a delivery is reduced, it is recorded, not apologized for. The tablet does not explain itself. It simply notes what occurred. The gods involved are often those later associated with the Anunnaki grouping. Their presence here is indirect, but persistent. Rather than acting, they are maintained. Their households receive supplies. Their cult personnel are fed. Their festivals are provisioned. The implication is not weakness, but embeddedness. These deities exist within the city's economy, not above it. Institutional dependency becomes visible through repetition. The same divine names recur across months and years, always tied to rations, never to production. The gods do not cultivate fields or tend flocks in these records. Their sustenance depends on human labor organized through temple administration. This dependency does not diminish their status within the system. Instead, it defines their role. Authority is expressed through entitlement, not self-sufficiency. Crucially, the texts do not frame these allocations as gifts. They are obligations. The language aligns more closely with entitlement than offering. Signs used to designate these distributions are shared with wages and allowances. The gods receive what is owed to their offices. The tone is contractual, not devotional. This framing challenges later assumptions about divine omnipotence. In these early records, power does not manifest as unlimited capacity, but as guaranteed access. The gods do not intervene to feed themselves. The system feeds them. That system must therefore persist for divine order to remain intact. If the flows of grain or beer falter, divine households falter with them. Such vulnerability would seem incompatible with mythic supremacy, yet the scribes recorded without hesitation. This suggests that dependency was not perceived as weakness, but as structure. The gods' authority lay in their position within a maintained order, not an exemption from material need. Their status was affirmed precisely because the city organized itself around sustaining them. The Anunnaki-associated deities, when present in these accounts, appear as collective beneficiaries rather than individual actors. This reinforces their linguistic treatment as functional groups. Their rations support assemblies, rituals, and institutional continuity. The emphasis remains on stability, not spectacle. What is absent once again is explanation. The tablets do not tell us why gods require rations. They do not justify the expense. They do not narrate divine hunger. The need is assumed, normalized, and managed. This assumption implies deep temporal roots. A practice routine rarely begins with a question. It begins with inheritance. Over time, the scale of these allocations grows. Temple complexes expand. Storage facilities multiply. Yet the basic logic remains unchanged. Divine sustenance is a line item. It is planned, executed, and verified. The gods, through their estates, are bound to the same administrative memory that governs the city. If authority depended on the maintenance of divine households through human-managed systems, Tente, God's rule was inseparable from bureaucracy. The Anunnaki, as overseers within this framework, would have been present not as distant creators, but as guarantors of a balance sustained through careful accounting. If the earliest records show gods receiving rations like institutional dependence, rather than autonomous powers, then was divine rule exercised through commandor, through participation in a system whose continuity mattered more than any single will. The distribution of goods implies space, and space implies form. Where rations are stored, where offerings are counted, there must be surfaces that endure repeated use. What emerges from the soil next is not revelation carved in stone, but platforms, broad, layered, and methodically renewed. Sacred architecture enters the record not as a sudden vision, but as an extension of earlier arrangements. The earliest temple platforms at Uruk do not announce themselves as final statements. They are rebuilt again and again on the same footprint, each phase respecting the alignment of the one beneath it. Mud brick gives way to mud, while and courtyards shift slightly, but orientation remains constant. The builders do not search for new forms. They preserve old ones, even when materials and labor would have allowed change. This conservatism becomes more striking across dynastic transitions. Political authority changes hands. Kings rise and fall, yet the sacred precincts maintain continuity of plan. In levels separated by centuries, the same cardinal alignments recur. The same axial approaches guide movement. The same elevation of sacred space above the surrounding city is maintained. The architecture behaves like memory solidified in clay. At Eridu, this pattern extends across a long span of occupation. Excavations reveal successive temples stacked one upon another, forming a slow accretion rather than a rupture. Each new structure respects the dimensions of the previous, sometimes narrowing slightly, sometimes expanding, but rarely abandoning the inherited outline. There is no moment of architectural invention that announces a new theology. The sacred remains recognizable to itself. The absence of radical innovation suggests that temples were not conceived as places of divine encounter in the revelatory sense. They were not designed to surprise or overwhelm. Their purpose appears procedural. They house offerings, archives, personnel, and rituals that follow prescribed patterns. The building supports function before it expresses meaning. This reading aligns with the administrative texts associated with these complexes. Storage rooms are integrated into temple layouts. Workspaces for scribes and priests are embedded within the sacred enclosure. The architecture accommodates repetition. It is built to endure cycles rather than moments. When stepped platforms later develop into what modern scholarship terms ziggurats, the transformation is incremental. Height increases, but orientation holds. Terracing becomes more pronounced, yet access routes remain formalized. The structure grows vertically without altering its conceptual base. It is an amplification, not a departure. Notably, there are no dedicatory inscriptions explaining why a particular form was chosen. Kings often record that they rebuilt or restored temples, emphasizing fidelity rather than creativity. The language of construction privileges restoration verbs. To build is to re-establish. To alter is to risk disruption of order. This architectural restraint mirrors the linguistic restraint seen in texts about the Anunnaki. Just as their names lack origin stories, So do the sacred buildings lack founding myths. The temple stands because it has always stood there, in some form. Its legitimacy derives from continuity, not from a remembered first moment. Even decorative elements follow this logic. Symbolic motifs repeat with little variation. Innovations, when they occur, are subtle changes. In proportion, refinement of technique, improved durability. They do not announce new cosmologies, they refine existing ones. The builders themselves appear to have understood their task as caretaking. Construction is framed as service. The king acts as steward of a sacred legacy that predates him. His role is to maintain alignment with inherited measures, both literal and symbolic. If divine authority required stable ground rather than dramatic expression, then architecture functioned as an anchor. The gods did not reveal themselves through new forms. They were accommodated through familiar ones. The Anunnaki, imagined as overseers of order, would have found their presence affirmed not by novelty, but by the unbroken rhythm of reconstruction. As layers accumulated and cities rose, sacred space grew taller, but not stranger. It remained predictable, legible, and bound to precedent. This predictability would have reassured communities that despite political change and environmental stress, the foundational order remained intact. If temples were rebuilt again and again without altering their essential design, and if divine presence was housed in continuity rather than innovation, then what did revelation mean in a world where the sacred was expected not to change? Continuity in brick and alignment gives way, eventually, to interruption in soil. The platforms do not end in collapse, but in layers that signal something abrupt enough to be remembered, yet restrained enough to be documented without explanation. Before the flood is named in literature, it appears in the ground as a technical problem, one that builders and scribes had to register before they interpreted it. At sites such as Shurup, excavators encountered a distinct stratum of clean alluvial silt separating earlier occupation from what came after. The layer is sterile, lacking debris, hearths, or domestic refuse. It is not burn nor abandonment spread over time. It is sudden deposition. Above it, life resumes. Below it, life had already been organized, settled, and methodical. Similar layers appear at Ur and other southern Mesopotamian sites, though not always at the same depth or date. The variation matters. It suggests not a single universal inundation, but a series of destructive flood events remembered locally, then reconciled later through textual convention. Archaeology preserves their physical reality without narrative unity. What stands out is how these layers are treated in rebuilding phases. Architecture resumes on top of them without visible ritual markers addressing trauma. Walls are relayed. Foundations are reset. Orientation often remains unchanged. Builders do not avoid the flooded ground. They incorporate it. The flood becomes a datum line, not a wound. The textual record mirrors this restraint. Early administrative tablets do not dwell on catastrophe. There is no lament embedded in accounting. Instead, there is adjustment, reorganization of labor, reallocation of resources. The practical aftermath is documented, not the emotional experience. Damage is inferred through changes in distribution, not through description. When later literary compositions reference a flood, the language remains curiously technical at first. The flood sweeps over the land. Kingship is taken elsewhere. These are procedural verbs. They describe what happens to systems, not what happens to people. The emphasis is on transfer and interruption of function. Notably absent is moral framing. Early references do not assign blame. There is no mention of transgression or punishment in the oldest strata of the record. The flood is treated as an event that disrupts administration, not justice. Only later do mythic elaborations attach ethical interpretation to it. From an archival perspective, the flood operates as a boundary marker. It divides lists into before and after. Reign lengths change, cities reappear. Kingship resumes its movement. The mechanics of authority remain intact, even if the personnel do not. This continuity suggests that the flood was not understood as an ending, but as a pause requiring The Anunnaki, when associated with flood narratives and later texts, are not depicted as reacting emotionally. They convene, decide, withdraw kingship, restore it. Their role aligns with oversight, rather than judgment. The flood alters conditions, but not the structure of authority itself. Archaeological silence reinforces this. No emergency temples appear immediately after flood layers. No radical architectural innovations emerge in response. The same forms are rebuilt, as though the event, however destructive, confirmed the necessity of existing order rather than undermining it. This approach to catastrophe reflects a worldview oriented toward preservation. Events happen, systems adapt. Memory is carried not in stories of survival, but in reinstated procedures. The flood is absorbed into the archive as a technical fact, later available for narrative expansion but not dependent on it. If early Mesopotamian societies encountered devastating floods yet recorded them first as logistical and stratigraphic realities rather than moral crises, then when the flood eventually receives a name and a story, is that story explaining the inventor, explaining how order managed to continue afterward. The technical treatment of disaster leaves behind those who remain. When kingship returns from its withdrawal, and cities rise again from sediment and silence, the voices that resume writing do not speak of beginnings. They do not describe confusion, discovery, or the slow accumulation of skill. Instead, they write as though interruption had only paused a known process. What follows the flood is not learning, but resumption. In post-flood sections of the Sumerian king list, the pattern reasserts itself with minimal adjustment. Kingship descends again. Cities receive it. Reign lengths shorten, but the structure of authority remains recognizable. There is no explanation for how cities remember how to rule, how scribes remember how to write, or how builders remember where foundations should be set. The text assumes continuity of knowledge without accounting for its preservation. Rebuilding inscriptions attributed to early dynasts reinforce this assumption. Kings identify themselves not as founders, but as restorers. Temples are made firm again. Walls are raised once more. Canals are cleared, not cut for the first time. The language consistently looks backward. Even when a ruler claims credit, it is framed as recovery of an earlier condition, not the introduction of novelty. This choice of verbs is not incidental. Sumerian royal inscriptions are careful documents, designed to endure. When kings wish to present themselves as innovators, they have linguistic tools to do so. Yet in the aftermath of the flood horizon, those tools are rarely employed. Instead, inscriptions emphasize fidelity to models that predate the current reign. The silence is striking when considered against the scale of implied loss. If cities were abandoned, populations displaced, and administrative centers disrupted, one might expect some acknowledgement of rupture. But the texts offer none. There is no mention of reteaching, writing, relearning measurement, or re-establishing law. Systems reappear fully formed, as though carried through the disruption intact. Even genealogies resume without hesitation. Kings list their fathers, their lineages, their city affiliations. The assumption of hereditary order persists. This suggests that social memory survived beyond physical destruction, whether carried by displaced populations, preserved in satellite settlements, or maintained through oral discipline. The record does not say, it simply demonstrates that memory was available. The Anunnaki, when referenced in these post-flood contexts, remain distant. They do not instruct survivors. They do not teach techniques or restore lost arts. Their role is limited to reinstating kingship and acknowledging the re-established order. This restraint reinforces their earlier characterization as overseers rather than teachers. What the texts present, then, is a civilization that expects itself to return. Destruction interrupts function, not identity. The absence of instructional language implies that the knowledge required to rebuild was never thought lost. It was dormant, awaiting conditions suitable for expression. Archaeology aligns with this perspective. Rebuilt cities often reuse earlier layouts. Street plans echo previous phases. Sacred precincts reclaim their former orientations. Such precision would be difficult without guiding memory. Trial and error leave traces. Here, there are few. Construction resumes with confidence. This confidence suggests that the survivors did not perceive themselves as founders of a new world. They were caretakers of an old one. Their task was not to imagine society anew, but to re-anchor it after displacement. The flood, in this light, functions as a test of continuity rather than a reset. The absence of learning narratives may also explain the persistence of administrative tone. Scribes continue to write as record keepers, not chroniclers of trauma. Their duty was to document what was restored, not to dwell on what was lost. Silence becomes a form of preservation. If the post-flood record refuses to describe the recovery of knowledge, because it assumes that knowledge endured, then the question shifts. What mechanisms carried civilization through the break so seamlessly that the survivors never felt compelled to explain how they knew what to rebuild? The rebuilding of order leaves a residue in language. When hymns and ritual compositions speak again, they do not linger on loss or instruction. Instead, they turn to procedure. The Anunnaki appear within these texts not as makers of worlds, but as participants in formal acts of distribution. What they do is assign, confirm, and fix. The verbs matter because they mirror the language used elsewhere for offices, lands, and duties. In liturgical texts preserved from places such as Nipa, the Anunnaki are invoked collectively at moments of decision. Destinies are said to be assigned in assembly, yet destiny, in these contexts, behaves less like fate and more like jurisdiction. The same verbal constructions are used when responsibilities are allotted among officials or when boundaries are set between institutions. The language is administrative before it is cosmological. This pattern is reinforced by lexical and god lists, such as an equals anum, where divine figures are organized by rank, association, and function rather than story. The Anunnaki occupy a classificatory position. They are not introduced as ancestors or innovators, but as holders of authority within an already articulated system. Their significance lies in placement, not narrative. When hymns describe the fixing of destinies, the act resembles confirmation of an existing order. The verbs do not imply experimentation or debate. They imply ratification. To fix is to stabilize, to make binding. This echoes legal language found in contracts and decrees, where terms are fixed to prevent dispute. Destiny, in this sense, is not an unknown future revealed, but a role assigned and upheld. The absence of creative verbs is notable. The Anunnaki do not fashion destinies from nothing. They do not invent offices teajoka. Even when cosmic order is implied, it unfolds through distribution, not generation. The world is not described as coming into being through their actions, but as being organized through their oversight. This distinction helps clarify why the Anunnaki rarely appear as protagonists. Protagonists act, struggle, and change. Appointers ensure continuity. Their authority is expressed through process, not drama. In assemblies, they sit. They witness. They confirm. These are the same actions attributed to councils of elders or judicial panels in human contexts. Such parallels are unlikely to be accidental. Sumerian scribes were trained within institutional environments where authority operated through consensus and record. When they described divine order, they reached for the same linguistic tools. The gods did not escape bureaucracy. They exemplified it. Even later mythic compositions that dramatize divine conflict retain this core logic. After struggle resolves, order is not invented anew. It is assigned, domains are up, functions are confirmed. The Anunnaki's role is clearest at this moment of settlement, where the emphasis returns to administration. This perspective also explains the stability of divine roles over time. If destiny is assigned rather than discovered, it can be preserved, transmitted, and restored. This aligns with the post-flood resumption of order, where kingship descends again without explanation. The same mechanism operates at different scales. The Anunnaki then occupy a space analogous to archivists of order. They ensure that what exists continues to exist in its proper place. Their authority depends on memorian, the preservation of assignments made long enough ago to feel inevitable. Creation, in this model, lies beyond the scope of the texts. What matters is maintenance. If destiny functions like jurisdiction, and if the Anunnaki are invoked as those who assign and confirm rather than invent, then their power rests not in origin but in continuity. They guarantee that roles endure across disruption. As this logic extends outward from kingship to temples, from flood to restoration, it begins to touch other domains of order. The heavens themselves will soon appear arranged rather than discovered, their patterns listed, fixed, and maintained. When the sky is measured and named, will it to reflect assignment rather than revelation? The assignments on earth extend upward without ceremony. When the sky enters the record, it does not arrive as an object of wonder or inquiry, but as a field already divided. The tablets that turn their attention toward the heavens do not describe looking, testing, or learning. They illist. They arrange. They preserve a celestial order that appears fully articulated at the moment it is first written down. Among the earliest astronomical texts, star lists stand apart for their confidence. In series later known through compendia, such as Mole, a pin, the sky is partitioned into paths, seasons, and groupings. Stars are named, their risings and settings associated with months, winds, and agricultural moments. The structure is systematic, ebendidactic, yet nowhere does the text describe how such knowledge was obtained. Observation is implied, but discovery is absent. The tone remains administrative. Stars belong to categories. They serve as markers. Their appearances confirm transitions already expected. The language used to describe them mirrors that used elsewhere for boundaries and assignments. A star stands in a path. A constellation belongs to a season. These are not metaphors of curiosity, but of placement. This absence of narrative experimentation is striking when compared to later scientific traditions that emphasize insight, hypothesis, or correction. Here, there is no correction. Variability in observation is smoothed into tabulation. The sky behaves predictably because it has been recorded as predictable. Any irregularity is subsumed into broader cycles rather than interrogated as anomaly. The scribes who compiled these lists worked within temple and court contexts, where predictability mattered. Astral knowledge supported calendars, ritual timing, and agricultural coordination. Its value lies in reliability. A star that rose too early or too late disrupted offerings and festivals. The goal was not understanding for its own sake, but alignment of human activity with a perceived cosmic schedule. Because of this functional orientation, the texts omit origins. They do not say when a star was first named or who noticed its pattern. The names themselves often lack descriptive clarity, suggesting they were inherited rather than coined at the moment of writing. Some names reference animals or objects, but many resist translation altogether. As with the Anunnaki, the sky's terms appear as accepted labels rather than explained concepts. The continuity of these lists across centuries reinforces this impression. Copyists reproduce the same arrangements, even as cities change and languages shift. Adjustments occur, but they are marginal. The framework persists. This persistence suggests that the authority of celestial order derived from its antiquity, not its demonstrable accuracy. To alter the list would risk misalignment between heaven and institution. When divine figures appear in relation to mathematics, they do so indirectly. Measurements are sometimes associated with temples or sacred spaces, implying divine oversight of proportion and balance. The Anunnaki, as guarantors of order elsewhere, would have encompassed numerical order as well. Yet they are not portrayed as mathematicians. They do not reveal numbers. They uphold a system in which numbers already operate reliably. This reliability would have been essential after disruption. Following floods and rebuilding, precise measurement ensures continuity. Foundations align, volumes calculated. Rations are distributed correctly. Mathematics enables restoration without reinvention. Its role in post-flood recovery reinforces the sense that it was never lost, only resumed. Even the most abstract tablets show restraint. They do not speculate. Te solbe, Italiano. Their confidence reflects a worldview in which order is calculable because it has always been so. Numbers describe reality, but they also maintain it. If a fully formed mathematical system appears in the earliest records without visible stages of development, then abstraction itself may have been treated as inherited knowledge. Mathematics, like kingship and the stars, arrives complete because it belongs to an order older than any single city or scribe. If numbers were already sufficient to rebuild land, time, and space after catastrophe, without explanation or debate, then what prior continuity made such precision possible before the tablets ever set it down? The precision of numbers gives way naturally to judgment. Once quantities can be measured and duties assigned, disputes follow, and with them the need for resolution that does not depend on the temperament of a single ruler. In the tablets that address conflict, responsibility, and repair, the language shifts again, but the underlying posture remains familiar. Justice does not appear as an invention. It is treated as something already present, waiting to be applied. Long before famous law codes are attributed to named kings, legal formulas circulate quietly in administrative contexts. Tablets from archives at Nippur and other centers record penalties, compensations, and obligations without preamble. They do not announce, "This is the law." They simply use it. A fine is assessed. A payment is required. A boundary is recognized. The authority of the rule lies not in who issued it, but in the fact that it is invoked at all. These early legal expressions are embedded in everyday records. Contracts specify consequences. Loan documents assume enforceable terms. Labor agreements reference obligations that need no explanation. The scribes write as though the framework of justice were already understood by all parties involved. There is no rhetorical flourish, no justification, no appeal to royal will. This becomes particularly clear when later rulers begin to inscribe what modern scholarship calls codes. In texts such as the Code of Yornamu, the king presents himself not as the creator of justice, but as its clarifier and restorer. The prologue emphasizes that right order existed and had been obscured. The king's task is to make it visible again. The laws themselves are framed as corrections, not innovations. The language of these codes reinforces that framing. Legal statements are conditional, procedural, and impersonal. They do not celebrate royal wisdom. They describe what happens if a condition is met. The structure resembles earlier administrative formulas more than proclamations. This continuity suggests that written law codified practices already in circulation rather than introducing new principles. Divine involvement follows the same pattern. The gods associated with justice do not dictate new rules. They are invoked as guarantors of an existing moral order. The Anunnaki, when present in juridical contexts, appear as witnesses to the legitimacy of the system, not as legislators. Law, like kingship and destiny, is something they uphold, not something they draft. This emphasis on precedent is visible in how disputes are resolved. Decisions reference prior agreements, establish measures, and recognize statuses. There is little sense of improvisation. Justice functions as recall rather than invention. To judge correctly is to remember accurately. Even punishment aligns with this logic. Penalties correspond to standardized outcomes. Injury is met with compensation. Loss is addressed with restitution. The aim is balance, not deterrence. Such balance presumes an agreed framework that transcends individual cases. The tablets do not argue for fairness. They enact Italiano. The absence of authorship is telling. Laws are not signed. They do not bear the names of their formulators. Authority is diffused across institutions rather than concentrated in a single figure. This diffusion mirrors the treatment of kingship itself, which descends, relocates, and persists independent of the individuals who temporarily embody it. For a society emerging from disruption, this approach offers stability. When disaster interrupts life, restoration requires standards that feel older than the moment. Law, if perceived as newly made, would lack that weight. Law, if remembered, can resume its function immediately. If justice in the earliest records is applied as precedent rather than proclaimed as decree, and if kings present themselves as restorers of an older right rather than founders of a new one, then law belongs to the same inherited order as numbers, stars, and authority. If divine justice was understood not as command but as confirmation of what already ought to be, then what earlier memory anchored these rules so firmly that even kings hesitated to claim authorship over them? The application of law assumes the restoration of bodhis as well as order. In the medical tablets, the same restraint that governs judgment extends into healing. Illness is recorded, diagnosed, and addressed through sequences that leave little space for wonder. What the texts preserve is not divine intervention, but procedure. Collections such as the diagnostic series known as Sakiko Present Illness. As a condition to be read, symptoms are listed in fixed progression. If this appears, if that follows, then the outcome is determined. The language is observational and conditional. There is no appeal to sudden reversal. Prognosis does not depend on divine mercy, but on recognition of pattern. These tablets classify afflictions by location, duration, and visible sign. The body is approached as a system subject to analysis. The scribe physician records what has been seen before and what followed. Experience accumulates quietly, folded into standardized phrasing. The authority of the text lies in repetition, not revelation. Incantations appear alongside these procedures, but their role is constrained. They accompany treatment, marking transitions or reinforcing outcomes, yet they rarely promise cure on their own. The gods are invoked as witnesses to the process, sometimes as guarantors that the procedure has been correctly performed. They oversee, but they do not act directly within the text. This division is striking. When a deity is named, it is often in a fixed formula at the beginning or end of an incantation. The core of the tablet remains technical. Ingredients are specified. Dosages are measured. Applications are timed. The presence of divine names does not interrupt the procedural flow. Healing is something done correctly, not bestowed. Even when illnesses are attributed to supernatural causes, the response is still methodical. A condition may be said to result from divine displeasure, yet the treatment proceeds through known steps. There is no narrative of the god relenting, no dramatic reversal. The outcome is predicted based on signs, not supplication. The Anunnaki, when referenced in broader medical contexts, remain distant. They do not diagnose, they do not apply remedies. Their role aligns with the maintenance of order that includes bodily order. Illness disrupts function. Healing restores balance. The gods ensure that the framework within which balance is restored remains intact. This perspective mirrors the handling of catastrophe elsewhere. Just as floods are absorbed into rebuilding without moral expansion, illness is absorbed into care without miracle. Both are disruptions managed through inherited knowledge. The tablets do not teach medicine again after the disaster. They assume continuity of practice. The scribes who copied these texts treated them as repositories of precedent. Marginal notes refine technique. Corrections adjust outcomes. Over time, the system becomes more precise, but never more dramatic. Improvement occurs through accumulation, not inspiration. The absence of miracles is not a denial of divine presence. It is a limitation on divine function. The gods do not override the process. They authorize it. This maintains consistency across domains. Authority remains stable when it does not intervene unpredictably. For those receiving treatment, this approach would have framed healing as a matter of timing and correctness. Survival depended on recognition and response, not on appeal. Such a worldview reinforces the broader pattern seen throughout the record. Systems endure because they are dependable, not because they astonish. If medicine was practiced as a disciplined craft, sustained by memory, and if gods were acknowledged only as overseers of that craft rather than its agents, then healing belonged to the same inherited order as law, number, and ritual. If even illness was addressed through preserved procedure rather than miraculous interruption, then what did the Sumerians believe would happen if memory itself failed, and who, if anyone, was responsible for ensuring that it did not? The preservation of procedure invites comparison, but the record itself resists travel. When similarities appear beyond Mesopotamia, they do not arrive as stories carried intact from one land to another. They appear as patterned structural echoes that resemble each other in form but remain anchored to local archives. The resemblance lies not in detail, but in posture. Civilization remembered as something received. In Egypt, early royal inscriptions frame kingship as a condition that already exists before individual rulers ascend. Authority is said to belong to Mahat, an order that the king maintains rather than invents. As in Mesopotamia, legitimacy does not begin with a narrative of discovery. It rests on alignment with an established cosmic arrangement. Flood imagery tied to the Nile functions similarly. Inundation renews, but does not reset. Order resumes because it was never considered lost. Along the Indus Valley, urban planning appears standardized across vast distances. Streets align. Bricks conform to ratios. Drainage follows consistent logic. Yet textual explanations are absent. There is no surviving literature describing how these systems were designed or learned. The cities present themselves as complete, not experimental. Order appears already agreed upon, inherited without commentary. In early Chinese tradition, the concept later articulated as the mandate of heaven frames rule as conditional upon harmony rather than innovation. Dynasties rise and fall, but authority itself is imagined as something transferred, not created. Flood narratives associated with early rulers describe engineering and restoration, not revelation. Control of water restores order, that is presumed older than any reign. These parallels should not be mistaken for shared origin. The languages differ. The gods differ. The environments shape different solutions. Yet the structural grammar recurs. Authority descends. Disaster interrupts but does not erase. Survivors restore rather than invent. The gods were present, oversee transitions but rarely teach techniques. What binds these records is not belief content, but archival silence. None of these traditions linger on the learning of civilization. None describe the first measurements, the first laws, the first temples as moments of discovery. Instead, systems are depicted as already in place when writing begins. This may reflect the nature of early record-keeping itself. Writing preserves what must be maintained, not what must be imagined. In Mesopotamia, this silence has often been filled later with elaborate myth. Elsewhere, it remains unspoken, yet the underlying assumption persists. Order predates memory. Civilization is not born within the text. It is inherited by it. This does not require transmission across continents. Similar pressures produce similar forms. Societies managing agriculture, water, and labor at scale may converge on narratives of inheritance, because inheritance stabilizes authority. Innovation invites challenges. Preservation invites compliance. The Anunnaki, framed as overseers rather than creators, fit within this broader pattern. They resemble other divine assemblies whose function is to confirm continuity. Their significance lies not in uniqueness, but in clarity. Mesopotamian records articulate this structure with unusual bureaucratic precision. If distant cultures echo the same structural silence about beginnings, then the absence itself becomes evidence not of contact, but of a shared administrative instinct. The earliest records everywhere seem less concerned with how civilization arose than with how it must continue. If this pattern emerges independently wherever order is recorded, then what does it suggest about the relationship between memory and authority? Why does the act of writing begin only after civilization already speaks as if it remembers? The parallels across cultures return attention to what made memory durable in one place. In southern Mesopotamia, memory did not rely on epic or lineage alone. It settled into rooms, shelves, and habits of copying. The archive did not merely store information. It organized continuity. What survived the disaster was not a story about the past, but a method for keeping it present. Excavations at sites such as Nippur and Uruk reveal archive spaces layered within temple and palace complexes. These were not libraries in the later sense. Tablets were stacked, sorted, and retrieved according to administrative need. Lists dominated, lists of officials, lists of offerings, lists of cities, lists of gods. The repetition was deliberate. Memory here was cumulative, not narrative. The scribal curriculum reinforces this structure. Students cope with lexical lists endlessly, reproducing columns of signs whose meaning lay in their order as much as in their content. Signs were grouped by function, category, or sound. The act of copying stabilized meaning over generations. To learn was to replicate faithfully, not to This practice favored preservation of form, even when context shifted. Such lists often contained information far older than the student copying them. God lists aligned deities according to rank and domain without recounting their histories. King lists preserved sequences that reached beyond living memory. City lists fixed relationships between places that had long ceased to exist as political centers. The archive thus carried forward strata of the past without integrating them into a single story. Columns and formatting mattered. The way information was arranged trained the eye to expect continuity. When a scribe encountered a familiar layout, he entered a known system of reference. This visual order functioned as cognitive order. It made the past legible without explanation. Administrative repetition had another effect. It detached knowledge from individual authority. A tablet rarely names its author. Even when a scribe signs his work, the content is presented as institutional property. Memory belongs to the office, not the person. This diffused ownership allows knowledge to persist when individuals vanish. The Anunnaki, embedded within these lists, benefit from this system. Their authority is preserved not through mythic elaboration, but through placement. They appear where they have always appeared. Their position within lists makes their role self-evident. To remove them would disrupt alignment, not belief. This mode of preservation also explains the absence of narrative origins. Stories change. Lists endure. A list can accommodate contradiction by sequence alone. Two reigns can overlap. Two gods can share a domain. The archive absorbs inconsistency without resolving it. Memory remains functional even when meaning shifts. During periods of disruption, this system proves resilient. Floods destroy buildings, but tablets can be dried, reburied, and when cities are abandoned, lists migrate with scribes. When dynasties fall, the curriculum remains. Knowledge survives because it is modular. It does not depend on a single master text. The bureaucracy thus functions as a slow-moving memory engine. Each copy reinforces the previous one. Errors are corrected against tradition. Innovations are filtered out unless they align with established form. This conservatism ensures stability, but it also obscures beginnings. The deeper the memory runs, the less visible its origin becomes. Royal inscriptions fit within this framework. Kings insert themselves into lists, not narratives. They restore temples according to prescient. They invoke gods by title, not story. Their legitimacy depends on aligning with archival memory. To rule is to conform. What emerges is a civilization that remembers through practice rather than recollection. Memory is enacted daily through accounting, scheduling, copying. The past survives because it is useful. It governs how goods move, how time is measured, how authority is assigned. Storytelling becomes secondary to operation. If bureaucracy preserved knowledge by making it ordinary, then forgetting would require more than loss. It would require disruption of the system itself. As long as lists could be copied, memory endured. But systems depend on context. Archives require stability, materials, trained scribes, and institutional support. When those conditions erode, memory does not fail at once. It thins. Columns shorten, list, fragment. If Sumerian memory was preserved not in talis, but in routine, then what happens when routine itself becomes impossible? And how does a civilization built on preservation respond when the act of remembering can no longer be maintained? The routines that preserve memory do not vanish when names grow faint. In the later layers of the record, references to the Anunnaki become sparse, formal, and eventually peripheral. Yet the systems they once framed continue with little visible disruption. Institutions outlast invocation. Authority persists, even as its divine vocabulary recedes. In administrative and legal texts, from the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia, divine assemblies appear less frequently as active overseers, where earlier compositions invoked collective groups to confirm destinies or legitimacies. Later documents move directly to procedure. Contracts are enforced. Calendars function. Offerings are scheduled. The machinery of order no longer requires constant divine citation to operate. This shift is not abrupt. It unfolds gradually, most noticeably in archival centers, such as Nippur, where religious tradition remains strong even as political control changed hands repeatedly. Tablets continue to list deities, but the Anunnaki recede into formulaic contexts invoked in prologues, mentioned in inherited phrases, rarely engaged in action. Their presence becomes symbolic rather than operational. At the same time, institutions grow more autonomous in their expression. Lore collections expand without expanding divine roles. Mathematical and astronomical texts refine their systems without increasing theological explanation. Medical texts rely more heavily on procedure and prognoses than invocation. The gods remain acknowledged, but no longer required to intervene directly for systems to function. Royal inscriptions reflect this adjustment. Kings continue to claim legitimacy through divine favor. Yet the tone shifts toward administrative competence. The ruler is praised for maintaining justice, organizing labor, and restoring temples. Divine approval is assumed rather than dramatized. The language suggests alignment with an inherited order rather than dependence on active divine command. This withdrawal does not imply disbelief. It implies normalization. Once authority has been stabilized through long practice, its symbolic origins need not be reset. The Anunnaki, having served as markers of order, can fade without dismantling the structure they once validated. Their function has been absorbed. The persistence of institutions through theological reduction raises questions about causality. Did systems endure because gods ruled them, Or were gods named to represent systems already understood as necessary? Late texts suggest the latter possibility without stating it explicitly. As divine narratives thin, administrative language thickens, even temple economies adapt. Offerings continue, but their scale and organization respond more to political and economic pressures than to mythic cycles. The temple becomes a civic institution as much as a sacred one. Its authority rests increasingly on tradition and infrastructure rather than divine immediate. This evolution mirrors earlier patterns. Kingship descended, withdrew, and descended again without explanation. Floods disrupted space without erasing order. Knowledge resumed without relay. In each case, continuity depended less on the presence of divine figures than on preservation of form. The fading of the Anunnaki thus reveals something about their original role. If their absence does not collapse the system, then their authority may always have been representative rather than executive. They embodied order so long as order needed embodiment. When order became self-sustaining, embodiment became optional. The tablets do not frame this as loss. There is no lament for departing gods and administrative records. Change is absorbed quietly. What matters is not who oversees, but that oversight continues to be performed now by institutions that have internalized their function. In this light, divine withdrawal resembles a transfer rather than an ending. Responsibility moves from named assemblies to entrenched practice. The gods retreat into titles, the titles into habit. Order persists because it has been rehearsed into permanence. If institutions continue without explicit divine direction, then divine rule may have been a language for describing stability rather than its source. The Anunnaki articulated an order that predated memory and outlasted narrative. If gods could withdraw without dismantling the systems they oversaw, then were they ever rulers in the conventional sense, or were they the last visible names attached to an administrative order whose origins lay deeper than the records that preserved it? What remains after the systems endure and the divine names thin is not an answer, but a boundary. The tablets, so careful in their accounting, so disciplined in their repetition, stop short of explanation. They do not resolve the tension they preserve. They maintain order, but they do not disclose its origin. Across centuries of record-keeping, the pattern holds. Kingship descends, withdraws, and returns without instruction. Law applies without authors. Numbers function without demonstration. Stars are listed without discovery. Healing proceeds without miracle. Even the gods, when present, administer rather than create. The archive is comprehensive in operation and reticent in cause. This reticence is not accidental. Sumerian scribes were capable of narrative when narrative served a purpose. They composed hymns, laments, and epics. They could dramatize when drama reinforced authority or memory. Yet the core mechanisms of civilization are preserved elsewhere, in lists and formulas that resist storytelling. Where explanation would invite debate, repetition ensures continuity. The contradictions remain unresolved because the tablets were not designed to resolve them. They were designed to function. They do not tell us whether kingship was learned or inherited, only that it was restored. They do not explain whether divine assemblies originated order or merely represented it, only that order was assigned and maintained. They do not clarify whether catastrophe erased knowledge or merely displaced it, only that rebuilding resumed with confidence. In this silence, multiple readings coexist. The Anunnaki can be read as rulers, in a theological sense, exercising authority over cosmos and city alike. They can be read as memories, names attached to a time before writing, preserved as placeholders for continuity. They can be read as mechanisms, symbolic expressions of an administrative order that required guardianship before it could internalize itself. The record neither confirms nor denies these possibilities. It accommodates all without committing to any. This flexibility may explain its endurance. A system that refuses to explain its beginnings cannot be disproven by their loss. It remains functional as long as its procedures can be repeated. Even the gaps are instructive. We do not know how the first lists were compiled. We do not know when measurements were standardized. We do not know how post-flood survivors coordinated rebuilding so efficiently. The absence of such knowledge in the record suggests that it was either assumed or inaccessible even to the scribes themselves. Memory had already replaced origin. What emerges instead is a civilization comfortable with incompleteness. Order does not depend on understanding its genesis. It depends on maintaining alignment. The archive teaches how to continue, not how to begin. In doing so, it shifts authority away from moments and toward processes. This may be why the Anunnaki fell without collapse. Their function was fulfilled once continuity no longer required explicit representation. The systems they once framed learned to speak in their own language, legal, numerical, architectural. Divine oversight became implicit rather than enacted. The tablets thus refuse the question modern readers most want answered. They do not tell us where civilization came from, only how it persisted. They do not tell us who first ruled, only how the rule was transferred. They do not tell us what was lost, only what was preserved. Perhaps this refusal is itself the answer they offer. In a world repeatedly disrupted by flood, political change, and environmental uncertainty, survival depended less on remembering beginnings than on ensuring resumption. To dwell on origin would be to risk fracture. To rehearse the procedure was to guarantee return. If the Anunnaki stand at the threshold between story and system, between memory and administration, then their true role may never have been to explain the world only, to make sure it continued to function. And if the tablets were never meant to answer how order began but only to ensure that it endured, then the remaining question is not who the Anunnaki were, but why a civilization so devoted to chose so consistently to leave its deepest origins unwritten.